So why does the United States have such high murder rates for a first world country? This is a question that I think is actually more complicated than a lot of people think. Because there's certain obvious answers, but those answers become less obvious when you actually look into it in more detail. Now, to put things in perspective, I believe the murder rate in the U.S. is currently somewhere in the six per 100,000 range, whereas in every other first world country it is generally two per 100,000 or slightly higher, but in many cases lower than that. So two or below, or maybe slightly higher. And the US is like six. So it's like three times higher than the next highest murder rate in a first world country. That's pretty bad. Now, the question is, why is this? Now, one thing I will preface by saying is that the discrepancy with the murder rate is much higher than for other crimes. When you look at other crimes, like robbery or assault or anything else, really, the discrepancy is a bit lower. In some cases, certain other first world countries might even be higher than the US. But for per capita murders, the US by far takes that very dubious crown. And the question is, why? Why is the US the murder king? Like the CEOs of Murder Inc. Why is the US so on its own, standing alone in being the first world country that has by far the highest murder rate? Now, there's two answers that people give, depending on what side of the political spectrum they fall on. Leftists tend to say it's because of guns and capitalism. Now, there could be some truth to that to an extent because the gun ownership is higher per capita than in other first world countries, although I'm not sure by the same amount as the murder rate, because Canada does have a fair amount of guns. So do other certain European countries like Finland and Austria. But for some reason, the US murder rate, I think I'm not entirely sure on this, but I think the discrepancy in the murder rate is greater than the discrepancy in the gun ownership rate. I could be wrong, but I think that's true. You can probably look up these statistics yourself. But in this case, I think the murder rate discrepancy is greater. It may or may not be, but nonetheless, I don't think guns by itself explains it. Because after all, there are certain parts of the US that still have a lot of guns, but not so high a murder rate. Like, I think certain states like Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, I think there's still a decent amount of guns there despite them being blue states. Now, some of the western inland heavily white states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, I think they have a low murder rate by US standards, but still higher than most other first world countries. Like, I think the only states in the US that have like murder rates that are on par with other, like most other first world countries are like basically Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Like, I think almost every US state has a higher murder rate than like 2.0, which would be considered a high murder rate for another first world country. So I don't know. Is it the guns? Doesn't explain it entirely, but it could definitely be a contributing factor. Yes. Another factor is, yeah, the capitalist system. The US has fewer worker protections, and I would guess probably less generous welfare policies on average compared to other first world countries. There's also people have to pay more in terms of healthcare bills, educational bills. So it could be that like the lack of a safety net makes people more desperate, makes people more likely to turn to crime, to violent crime. That would explain it to an extent, but it's like, why is the discrepancy there for murder more than other crimes? Because it's like, if it was about poverty, then you'd think that like mugging, for instance, or like burglary, robbery, theft, like crimes related to stealing, you would think that would be where the biggest discrepancy would be if poverty was the main cause. So I'm not so sure that we can say that it's necessarily a poverty issue for those reasons. Because as I said, the discrepancy is a lot less for those types of crimes. Like in regards to like robbery, like mugging, burglary, theft, like with those types of crimes, the discrepancy between the US and other first world countries is much smaller than for murder in terms of the per capita averages. So let's get into the right wing explanations. Like one big right wing explanation is that America's black population, like whether the explanation be genetic or cultural, that it has heavily to do with the black population specifically. And I mean, when you look at the statistics, yes, it's true. The 13 do 50 or whatever it is exactly, that whole meme, it does check out, like it is statistically accurate. And then there's also the mestizo population has a considerably higher murder rate than the whites do, although not nearly as high as the blacks. So there are these factors, but here's my counterpoint to that. Have any of you guys been to France lately? I've been to France lately. There's a fucking lot of blacks there. Now, France does not officially take racial statistics, but people have estimated the black population of France is over 10%. I would guess higher than that. Like, I don't know. It's probably getting pretty close to the black percentage in America. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if France had a higher black percentage than the US does. It's probably close. And people who've been to France mostly corroborate that. Like, I mean, that Kanye West and Jay-Z song is pretty accurate, you know? The one about Paris. So my question is, if vibrancy is the reason, I mean, and yes, in France, the same overrepresentation exists. Like the black population is much higher represented there in crime statistics as they are pretty much everywhere. Like if you have a country with a black and white population together, there will be similar discrepancies where the black population has a disproportionately high crime rate. However, that being said, when you compare the murder rate in France to the murder rate in the US, it's incomparable. I think France's murder rate is like 1/5 of that of the United States. It's way lower. It's not even terribly high by Western European standards. Like you'd think France would have the highest in Western Europe, but I don't think it does. I think the highest murder rate in Western Europe is actually, I think, Belgium, which might be for similar reasons because they have some vibrancy as well, but not as much as France does per capita. I don't think so. Like I would, if I had to guess, I would guess the country in Europe with the highest black percentage would be either France or Portugal. And in Portugal, it really depends on your definition of black because there's a lot of like Brazilians there who are like, you know, 75% face or what have you. So it's like there's that, but regardless, neither Portugal nor France has a terribly high murder rate, not even by European standards and definitely not compared to the US. So like while there is the same discrepancy where there probably is a 13 do 50 discrepancy in France and Portugal also, but the thing is the 13 and the 50, that doesn't, like the 50 isn't 50% of the same murder rate. It's 50% of a murder rate that's 1/5 as high. So even if the same discrepancy exists where disproportionate amounts of the murders are committed by a minority population, nonetheless, the per capita murder rate of that minority population is still way fucking lower than that of the US. Like it would mean if the overall murder rate is 1/5 as high in France as in the US and 13 do 50 in both countries, it would still mean the black homicide rate in France is 1/5 of the black homicide rate in the US. So what is going on there? What is the cause of this discrepancy? Why does America specifically have these problems? And I think even if you took the white population in the US, I've seen statistics where it's like the white murder rate in the US, the non-Hispanic white murder rate is like, I think like in the neighborhood of 1 point, or maybe like 2 per 100,000, or maybe 1.5 to 2. I don't know. It would still place it higher than average. It would be in the neighborhood of Western European countries. but it would still be higher than average. And that's the overall total for those Western European countries, which includes the non-whites in those countries. So for it to be a real apples to apples comparison, you'd have to have statistics just for the murder rate of the whites in those Western European countries, which I don't think exist or aren't easy to find. And when I say Western Europe, I think even most Eastern European countries have a lower murder rate than the US. I think the only ones with higher murder rates might be Russia, Ukraine, and I'm talking before the war. Like, I don't even know how war violence factors into murder rate calculations, but like even before the war, yeah, Ukraine and Russia, and I think Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania might have had somewhat high murder rates, or maybe like Moldova or Albania. But definitely, okay, some of the West, I think Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, and Slovenia are all more on par with Western Europe in that regard. But nonetheless, okay, if you're looking at first world countries specifically, the US definitely stands out. So why is it? I'm going to guess it's a combination of all the above factors. I'm going to say when you put certain factors together, I think they might multiply the effects. And in regards to murder rates specifically, I think that's what it is. I think it's basically, it's a combination of guns plus vibrancy. Like if you have vibrancy without guns or guns without vibrancy, the effects may not be nearly as severe, but when you combine the two together, I think that's when you start seeing these really high murder rates. So that, in my opinion, is, and perhaps plus the third ingredient of like a somewhat more capitalistic society. So I think it's all these things combined, and I think all of them together are much greater than the sum of their parts in terms of their contribution toward the murder rate being higher. So that's my theory. What are yours? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, that's all for now.